By the end of 1914, this war was never meant to look like this. Military planners had promised speed, politicians had promised control, and millions of soldiers had been promised a quick return home. Instead, Europe froze. Across hundreds of kilometers, two massive armies stood facing each other, not advancing, not retreating, simply waiting. The rapid movements of the early months had vanished. Offensives failed, flanks collapsed, and every attempt to break through ended the same way, with bodies on the ground. What no one expected was silence, a deadly stillness spreading across the Western Front. The war had not ended, it had stopped moving, and in that moment a new kind of warfare was born, one that would consume men slowly, relentlessly, without mercy. When attacks failed again and again, survival became the priority. Not victory, not glory, just survival. Bullets came from nowhere, artillery fell without warning, and the open battlefield became a death sentence. So soldiers did the only thing that made sense. They went down. They dug into the earth with shovels, bayonets, even bare hands. At first, the trenches were shallow, temporary protection, but as days passed, they grew deeper, longer, stronger. What began as shelter became structure. What was meant to last hours began lasting months. Entire armies disappeared beneath the surface. The battlefield no longer belonged to the land above. It belonged to the soil below. Inside the trenches, war lost any trace of romance. There were no heroic charges here, no speeches, no victories to celebrate. Only mud, water, and waiting. Men lived packed together in narrow corridors carved into the earth. They slept standing up. They ate whatever could be delivered. They breathed damp air thick with rot. Rats moved freely, feeding on the dead. Disease spread quietly from man to man. Fear became constant. Every sound could signal artillery. Every silence felt unbearable. This was not the battlefield soldiers had imagined. It was survival reduced to its most brutal form. Between the trenches lay a place without ownership. No flags marked it, no shelter protected it. They called it no man's land. Once fields and farms, it became a wasteland of mud and wire. Every meter was observed, every movement answered with gunfire. Shells tore the ground apart until nothing remained alive. Bodies lay where they fell, unreachable, unmourned. To step into no man's land was to accept uncertainty, to accept that survival depended on luck alone. It was the most dangerous ground on earth. Despite the reality on the ground, orders kept coming. Commanders still believed in attack. They believed discipline could overcome machine guns. They believed courage could outrun bullets. Whistles blew. Men climbed out of the trenches and moved forward, slowly, openly, directly into fire. Machine guns did not hesitate. Artillery did not miss. Entire units vanished in minutes. The ground absorbed them without memory. To advance was not bravery, it was arithmetic, and the numbers always favored death. Before this war, no army truly understood what a machine gun could do. They were seen as support weapons, defensive tools, something secondary. That illusion ended in the trenches. A single machine gun crew could stop hundreds of men, not slowly, not gradually, in seconds. Attack formations designed for earlier wars collapsed instantly. Lines disappeared. Officers fell first. Momentum died before it could begin. What once required courage and numbers now required something armies did not yet possess, a way to survive modern firepower. The battlefield had changed, the tactics had not, and men paid the price. If machine guns ruled the surface, artillery ruled everything else. Shells fell day and night, without warning, without pause. Men never saw what killed them. They only heard the sound, and then nothing. Entire landscapes were erased. Trees vanished. Villages dissolved into dust. The ground itself became unstable, cratered, flooded, alive with explosions. Artillery did not just kill bodies. It destroyed nerves. It shattered sleep. It broke the mind. This was not combat. It was bombardment without end.
For most soldiers, the war was not constant fighting. It was waiting. Waiting for orders. Waiting for supplies. Waiting for the next shell. Hours passed in silence. Days blurred together. Men stared at the same stretch of mud, knowing that at any moment everything could end. This waiting was its own kind of torture. It allowed fear to grow unchecked. It gave the mind time to imagine the worst. In the trenches, time did not heal. It only stretched the suffering.
The human mind was never meant to endure this. Endless noise, constant danger, no escape. Some men stopped speaking. Others shook uncontrollably. Many simply broke. They called it shell shock. They did not understand it. They often punished it. But this was not weakness. It was the mind reaching its limit. War was no longer only destroying bodies. It was destroying people from the inside.
By 1915, the truth was impossible to ignore. Millions were dead. Millions more were trapped. Neither side could advance. Neither side could withdraw. Every new attack promised the same result: more bodies, less ground. The war had become a deadlock, a grinding stalemate. And as the months dragged on, one question grew louder than any explosion. How do you end a war that no one can move forward in? If armies could not move forward, they searched for something new, something decisive. Engineers, scientists, and commanders were given a single task: break the deadlock. Old rules were questioned. New weapons were rushed to the front. Anything that promised advantage was considered. This was no longer just a military struggle. It was an industrial race. Factories replaced strategy. Production replaced imagination. The war was about to change again, not because it had to, but because it could. Science had always supported war. Now it led it. Chemists, engineers, physicists, men who once studied progress were now asked to perfect destruction. Laboratories turned into weapons workshops. Formulas became tools of death. Distance no longer mattered. Accuracy mattered less. Volume mattered most. For the first time, modern science was fully mobilized, not to save lives, but to end them faster. The battlefield was becoming experimental, and the soldiers were the test subjects. The weapons changed faster than the men who used them. New tools arrived at the front with little explanation and no preparation. Soldiers trained for rifles now faced firestorms of steel. Instructions were brief, mistakes were fatal. What once required skill and courage now demanded endurance and luck. The gap between technology and training widened, and the men in the trenches stood in between. Before gas came fear of the unknown. Rumor spread faster than orders. Strange smells, burning eyes, invisible threats. Men whispered about new weapons that could crawl across the battlefield. No one knew when it would arrive or how to stop it. The air itself began to feel dangerous, and soldiers waited, knowing that something worse was coming. By the middle of the war,
The battlefield stood on a threshold. Everything old had failed. Everything new was untested. Commanders searched for a breakthrough. Soldiers sensed disaster. What was about to be unleashed would change warfare forever. Not with noise, but with silence. The next chapter of this war would not arrive with explosions. It would arrive on the wind.
When the gas finally came, it did not announce itself with explosions. There was no warning shot, no thunder, only a strange cloud moving slowly across the battlefield. At first, some soldiers thought it was smoke. Others believed it was harmless. They were wrong. The gas crept into trenches, hugging the ground, slipping into lungs and eyes. Men began to cough, then choke, then panic. War had found a new weapon, one that attacked the body from the inside.
The first reaction was confusion. The second was terror. Men clawed at their throats, desperate for air that no longer helped them. Orders vanished in the chaos. Discipline collapsed. Some tried to run. Others froze where they stood. There was no enemy to shoot, no direction to charge. The battlefield dissolved into instinct. Fight, flee, or suffocate. For the first time, nature itself had become the weapon. Survival demanded adaptation. Cloth soaked in urine, improvised masks, desperate measures. Soon, proper gas masks arrived, awkward, heavy, terrifying in their own way. Breathing became mechanical, vision narrowed. The face of the soldier disappeared behind rubber and glass. To survive, men had to become something else, something less human. Gas did not replace bullets or shells. It joined them. The battlefield became layered with threats, seen and unseen. Survival now depended on timing, on equipment, on luck. A soldier could do everything right and still die choking in a trench. The war had crossed a line. From this point on, there were no limits left to test. Perhaps the most disturbing change was not the weapon itself, it was how quickly men adapted. Gas attacks became routine, masks were checked like rifles, fear became procedural. What once caused panic became another line in orders. The extraordinary turned ordinary. And as soldiers adjusted to breathing through rubber, the war continued, just as brutal, just as endless. Fatigue became universal. Not the kind cured by sleep, but a deeper exhaustion that settled into bones and minds. Men grew older in months, faces hardened, eyes dulled. Every movement required effort. Every day felt longer than the last. Even fear grew tired. In the trenches, survival was no longer heroic. It was mechanical, a routine carried out by bodies running on empty. Time lost its meaning. Days blended together. Weeks passed without markers. Men stopped counting, stopped asking how long they had been there. Only rotations mattered, only survival until the next relief. The future shrank to hours, sometimes minutes. In the trenches, time did not move forward, it dissolved. Slowly, something else began to fade. Compassion, shock, reaction. Men stepped over bodies without stopping, not because they were cruel, but because they could no longer afford to feel. Death became familiar. Loss became expected. To continue functioning, soldiers learned to numb themselves. The war did not only destroy lives, it eroded what made life human.
And yet, life continued. Men ate, they joked, they wrote letters home. In between shelling and fear, normality forced its way through. These moments were fragile, temporary, but they mattered because they reminded soldiers that there was still a world beyond the trench walls, even if it felt impossibly far away.
By now, endurance mattered more than bravery. Not the strength to charge forward, but the strength to remain, to wake up, to wait, to survive another day. The trenches did not reward heroes, they rewarded persistence. And as the war dragged on, those who endured became the backbone of armies, not because they wanted to fight, but because they could still stand. By now, the trenches felt less like defenses and more like cages. The walls closed in, the horizon disappeared. Men spoke of the war as something above them, something happening somewhere else. The trench became the entire world. Everything beyond it felt unreal. There was no sense of advance, no sense of retreat, only containment. The war was no longer surrounding the soldiers, it was enclosing them. Leaving the front did not mean escaping the war. Those sent to the rear carried it with them, in their sleep, in their silence. The trenches followed them everywhere. There was no clean return, no reset. Once a soldier had lived inside the trench system, it became permanent. The war marked men long before it killed them, and for many, there was no way back to who they had been. Eventually, the unimaginable became routine. Mud, gas, shelling, all accepted as part of daily life. Men adapted not because they wanted to, but because they had to. This adaptation was not strength, it was necessity. The war reshaped behavior, emotion, expectation. What once horrified now barely registered. And that may have been the war's greatest victory. By this stage, few spoke of victory. They spoke of survival, of rotations, of time served. The idea of an end felt abstract. The war had no clear direction, only continuation. It consumed resources, bodies, years, without offering resolution. This was not a campaign anymore. It was a condition. The stalemate could not last forever. Something had to break. Not the trenches, but the limits holding the war in place. What followed would be larger, more violent, more industrial. Entire nations would be pushed beyond endurance. The war was about to escalate, not gradually, but catastrophically. The next phase would no longer be about holding ground. It would be about breaking everything else.